What happens when a simple human security contractor becomes the most valuable prisoner in the galaxy? When Marcus Chun signed up to protect an alien princess during peace negotiations, he thought the biggest threat would be assassins. He never imagined that saving her life would make him a target of the most powerful alien queen in known space. Not for execution, but for something far more terrifying. She refuses to let him leave. In a universe where humanity is still considered a minor species, one man's act of heroism will challenge everything the galaxy believes about human nature, loyalty, and the true meaning of strength. Because sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought with weapons. They're fought with the courage to remain human when the entire universe wants to change you. The story that follows will take you on a journey across star systems, through alien courts, and into the heart of what makes humanity truly extraordinary. Prepare yourself for a tale where honor becomes a prison, heroism becomes a curse, and one human's refusal to break will shake the foundations of an entire galactic empire. Marcus Chun adjusted his grip on the plasma rifle for the 100th time that morning, his eyes scanning the Grand Diplomatic Hall, where representatives from 12 different species had gathered for what many called the most important peace summit in galactic history. The Terran Diplomatic Corps had hired him and his small team of human security contractors to provide protection during the negotiations, a job that paid well, but seemed routine enough. After all, humans were still relatively new to galactic politics, and most alien species consider them barely above primitives in terms of technology and influence. The centerpiece of these negotiations was Princess Zalera of the Vorthak Empire, whose crystalline blue skin seemed to shimmer under the artificial lighting of the space station. Her species was known for their advanced technology and strategic importance in the ongoing conflicts between the major galactic powers. The princess herself was rumored to be the key to a potential alliance that could shift the balance of power across 3-star systems. Marcus had been watching her for 3 days now, noting how she carried herself with the practiced grace of someone born into power, yet there was something in her large, amber eyes that suggested she understood the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. Unlike many of the other diplomatic representatives, she treated the human security detail with courtesy rather than the barely concealed disdain they usually encountered from more advanced species. The morning session had been progressing smoothly when Marcus noticed something that made his trained instincts kick into high alert. One of the Krellian delegates, a reptilian species known for their military prowess, had been unusually fidgety throughout the discussions. More concerning was the way his hand kept drifting toward what appeared to be a ceremonial weapon at his side, though Marcus knew that no actual weapons were supposed to be present in the diplomatic area. The security scanners at the entrance were supposedly foolproof, capable of detecting any known weapon technology from dozens of species. But Marcus had learned during his military service that determined individuals always found ways around security measures, especially when they had inside knowledge of the systems being used. The Krellian delegate, Ambassador Thex, had arrived with full diplomatic credentials and had passed through security without any issues, but something about his behavior was setting off every alarm bell in Marcus's head. Princess Zalera was in the middle of presenting a detailed proposal for resource-sharing agreements when Marcus saw Thex's hand finally, close around what he had been reaching for. In a split second, Marcus recognized the distinctive energy signature of a bioweapon, something that would have been undetectable by conventional scanners because it was grown rather than manufactured. The Krellians were known for their biotechnology, though using it for assassination attempts was supposedly beneath their warrior code. Time seemed to slow as Marcus watched Thex rise from his seat, the bioweapon now clearly visible as a crystalline shard that pulsed with internal energy. The weapon was small enough to conceal easily, but powerful enough to penetrate most forms of personal shielding. More importantly, Marcus could see from the trajectory that Thex was aiming directly at Princess Zalera, who remained focused on her presentation and completely unaware of the immediate threat. Without hesitation, Marcus launched himself from his position near the wall, his combat training taking over as he calculated angles and distances in a fraction of a second available to him. The other security personnel were too far away to intercede, and the diplomatic protocols that governed the summit meant that most of the alien delegates had their own personal shields activated, which would prevent them from moving quickly enough to help. The bioweapon discharged just as Marcus reached the princess, the crystalline projectile streaming through the air with deadly accuracy. Marcus managed to tackle Zalera to the ground, his body positioned between her and the incoming threat. The weapon struck him in the shoulder, and immediately he felt a burning sensation that spread rapidly through his nervous system. Bioweapons were designed to be species-specific, but the Krellian version was particularly nasty because it adapted to whatever biological system it encountered. The chaos that erupted in the diplomatic hall was immediate and overwhelming. Security alarms began blaring as automated systems detected the weapon discharge, while delegates from multiple species either activated personal protection protocols or scrambled for the exits. Marcus could hear Princess Zalera calling out in her own language, her voice filled with concern and surprise, but the bioweapon was already affecting his ability to process sensory information clearly. The next few minutes were a blur of activity as medical personnel rushed to the scene and security teams moved to apprehend Ambassador Thex. Marcus was dimly aware of being lifted onto a medical transport, but the bioweapon was designed to cause rapid system failure in most carbon-based life forms. The medics working on him were clearly struggling to counteract its effects, especially since human physiology was still relatively unknown to most galactic medical professionals. As consciousness faded, Marcus could hear Princess Zalera arguing with someone, her voice carrying an authority that cut through the general confusion. She was demanding that the best medical specialists be brought in immediately, regardless of cost or diplomatic complications. The last thing he remembered was the feeling of her cool, crystalline hand touching his forehead, and her voice speaking in surprisingly clear, standard galactic, promising that she would not let him die for saving her life. When Marcus regained consciousness 3 days later, he found himself in a medical facility unlike anything he had ever seen. The walls seemed to be made of some kind of living crystal that pulsed with soft, healing energy, and the air itself felt charged with restorative properties. More surprising was the fact that Princess Zalera was sitting beside his bed, her formal diplomatic attire replaced with simpler clothes that somehow made her seem more approachable. She explained that the bioweapon should have killed him within minutes, but human physiology had proved remarkably adaptable. Instead of succumbing to the toxin, his immune system had somehow learned to neutralize it, though the process had nearly killed him in the attempt. The medical specialists she had brought in were fascinated by his recovery and wanted to study it further, but she had insisted that his privacy and dignity be respected above their scientific curiosity. The assassination attempt had effectively ended the peace summit, with most delegates returning to their home worlds amid increased security concerns. However, Princess Zalera had remained on the space station specifically to ensure that Marcus received proper medical care. She felt personally responsible for his condition, since he had been injured while protecting her, and her sense of honor demanded that she see to his recovery personally. As they talked, Marcus began to understand that his actions had created complications far beyond the immediate diplomatic fallout. In Vorthack culture, someone who saved a royal family member's life created a debt of honor that could only be repaid through specific ceremonial processes. More importantly, his willingness to sacrifice himself for someone from another species had demonstrated qualities that the Vorthack considered extremely rare and valuable. The princess explained that news of his heroic actions had already reached her homeworld, where it had caused quite a stir among the royal court. The Vorthack Empire was currently engaged in a complex political situation involving succession rights and military alliances, and Marcus's demonstration of loyalty and courage had attracted the attention of some very powerful individuals. Unfortunately, this attention was not necessarily a good thing, especially for someone who just wanted to return home and resume his normal life. What Princess Zalera didn't tell him immediately was that her mother, Queen Vestra of the Vorthack Empire, had already issued a formal decree regarding Marcus's status. The queen was known throughout the galaxy for her strategic brilliance and ruthless pursuit of anything that might benefit her empire. She had heard the reports of a human who had willingly sacrificed himself to protect her daughter, and she had decided that such an individual would be valuable as more than just a temporary security contractor. The conversation was interrupted when a communication device activated, displaying the holographic image of an imposing figure that Marcus immediately recognized as Queen Vestra herself. The queen's crystalline features were sharper and more angular than her daughter's, and her amber eyes held an intelligence that seemed to pierce through any attempt at deception. When she spoke, her voice carried the absolute authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Queen Vestra addressed Marcus directly, speaking in perfect Standard Galactic with an accent that somehow managed to sound both elegant and threatening. She thanked him for protecting her daughter and acknowledged the debt of honor that his actions had created. However, she also made it clear that she had no intention of simply letting him return to his previous life as if nothing had happened. Someone with his demonstrated loyalty and courage was too valuable to waste on routine security work for minor species. The Queen informed Marcus that she was formally requesting his transfer to the Vorthak Empire, where he would be given a position of honor and responsibility within the Royal Guard. This was presented as a great privilege, since humans had never before been offered such positions within advanced alien civilizations. However, the way she phrased the request made it clear that she expected compliance rather than negotiation. Princess Zalera looked uncomfortable during this exchange, but she did not contradict her mother's statements. Marcus began to realize that he had inadvertently stepped into a situation far more complex than a simple diplomatic protection assignment. The Queen's interest in him was clearly more than just gratitude for protecting her daughter, though he couldn't yet understand what larger game was being played. The medical staff entered the room at that point, informing them that Marcus was sufficiently recovered to be moved if necessary. Queen Vestra took this as confirmation that the arrangements for his transfer could proceed immediately. She ended the communication by informing him that a Vorthak diplomatic vessel would arrive within 2 days to escort him to the Empire's capital world, where his new duties would be explained in detail. As the holographic image faded, Marcus found himself alone with Princess Zalera, who finally allowed her carefully controlled expression to show signs of concern. She apologized for her mother's directness, explaining that Queen Vestra was accustomed to making decisions quickly and expecting others to adapt to them. However, she also warned him that refusing the Queen's request would be extremely difficult and potentially dangerous, since it would be interpreted as rejecting the honor being offered to him. Marcus spent the remainder of that day trying to process the implications of his situation. What had begun as a routine security job had somehow transformed into a life-changing event that would take him away from everything familiar and thrust him into the center of alien politics. He had signed up to protect a princess during peace negotiations, not to become a permanent fixture in an alien royal court. The irony was not lost on him that his success in protecting Princess Zalera had created a prison of honor from which there might be no escape. Queen Vestra's interest in him was clearly motivated by more than simple gratitude, and he suspected that his value to the Vorthak Empire had more to do with his human nature than with his specific skills as a security professional. As night fell on the space station, Marcus lay in his medical bed staring out at the stars, wondering if he would ever see Earth again. The bioweapon had failed to kill him, but in saving Princess Zalera's life, he might have inadvertently sacrificed his own freedom. Tomorrow would bring the Vorthak diplomatic vessel, and, with it, a journey into the unknown that would test everything he believed about duty, honor, and the true cost of heroism. The princess had promised to speak with her mother about allowing him some choice in the matter, but Marcus could see in her eyes that she held little hope of changing the queen's mind. Queen Vestra had decided that he belonged to the Vorthak Empire now, and queens who ruled galactic empires were not known for changing their minds once they had identified something they wanted. The Vorthak diplomatic vessel arrived precisely when Queen Vestra had promised. Its sleek crystalline hull, reflecting the light from the space station's docking bays in patterns that seemed almost hypnotic. Marcus had spent the previous 2 days trying to find some way out of his situation, but every inquiry he made only reinforced how thoroughly trapped he had become. The Terran Diplomatic Corps expressed regret about his circumstances, but made it clear that they could not interfere with what the Vorthak Empire considered an internal matter of honor and debt. Princess Zalera had tried to negotiate with her mother during several private communications, but Queen Vestra remained unmoved by her daughter's arguments. The Queen had made up her mind about Marcus's value to the Empire, and she saw no reason to reconsider her decision simply because the human in question might have personal preferences about his future. From her perspective, She was offering him opportunities that no member of his species had ever been granted, and his reluctance to accept them was both puzzling and irrelevant. The diplomatic escort that came to collect Marcus consisted of 6 Vorthack guards wearing ceremonial armor that somehow managed to look both beautiful and intimidating. Their leader introduced himself as Commander THYSS, a veteran officer whose crystalline features bore the subtle scarring that marked him as someone who had seen actual combat rather than just ceremonial duties. He treated Marcus with professional courtesy, but made it clear that this was not a request that could be declined. The journey to the Vorthack capital world of Zentera took 5 days through hyperspace, during which Marcus was given quarters that were more luxurious than anything he had ever experienced. The ship's technology was at least 2 generations ahead of anything humans had developed, and every surface seemed to be designed with both functionality and aesthetic appeal in mind. However, the comfort of his accommodations could not disguise the fact that he was essentially a prisoner, albeit one being treated with unusual respect. During the voyage, Commander THYSS spent considerable time explaining Vorthack culture and customs to Marcus, apparently under orders to ensure that he would not inadvertently cause offense when presented to the royal court. The Vorthack Empire was built on rigid hierarchies and complex social protocols that had evolved over thousands of years. Honor and loyalty were considered the highest virtues, but they were defined in very specific ways that did not always align with human understanding of those concepts. The commander explained that Queen Vestra's interest in Marcus went beyond simple gratitude for protecting her daughter. The Vorthack Empire was currently facing external threats from rival powers and internal challenges from noble families who questioned the Queen's policies. In such circumstances, having a proven example of absolute loyalty could be extremely valuable, especially if that loyalty could be demonstrated to come from someone with no personal stake in Vorthack politics. Marcus began to understand that he was being positioned as a symbol rather than simply as a guard or advisor. His willingness to sacrifice himself for Princess Zelera had demonstrated qualities that the Queen wanted to associate with her reign and her family. By bringing him into the royal household and showcasing his loyalty, she could reinforce her own image as someone who inspired such devotion, even from aliens who owed her nothing. The political implications became clearer when Commander THYSS explained the current succession crisis that was consuming much of the royal court's attention. Queen Vestra had 3 potential heirs, but the traditional succession laws were complicated by various factors, including military achievements, political alliances, and demonstrations of worthiness to rule. Princess Zelera was actually the youngest of the 3, but her role in the recent diplomatic negotiations had elevated her status considerably. The assassination attempt that Marcus had thwarted was apparently not an isolated incident. Several members of the royal family had faced similar threats in recent months, suggesting that someone was systematically attempting to eliminate potential heirs to the throne. Queen Vestra's decision to bring Marcus into the royal guard was partly motivated by her belief that his demonstrated loyalty could be crucial in protecting her children during this dangerous period. When the ship finally emerged from hyperspace near Zentera, Marcus got his first glimpse of the Vorthack capital world and immediately understood why the Empire commanded such respect throughout the galaxy. The planet's surface was covered with cities that seemed to grow like crystals from the landscape itself, their spires reaching toward the sky in patterns that were both organic and precisely engineered. The orbital installations surrounding the planet were equally impressive, forming a defensive network that could probably withstand attacks from entire fleets. The capital city of Vorthra was a marvel of architecture and engineering that demonstrated the full extent of Vorthack technological advancement. Buildings that appeared to be carved from single massive crystals housed millions of inhabitants, while transportation systems moved people and goods through the city with efficiency that made human traffic management look primitive by comparison. The Royal Palace complex occupied the center of the city, its towers and courtyards covering an area larger than most human cities. Marcus was escorted directly to the palace upon landing, bypassing the normal customs and security procedures that would have applied to other visitors. The corridors they walked through were filled with artwork and decorative elements that represented thousands of years of Vorthack culture. But Marcus found it difficult to appreciate the beauty when he was so focused on the uncertainty of his situation. He was about to meet one of the most powerful individuals in known space, and his entire future would depend on that encounter. Queen Vestra received him in a throne room that was designed to impress and intimidate visitors. The chamber was carved from a single massive crystal that refracted light in ways that made the queen appear to be surrounded by living rainbow patterns. Her throne was positioned on a raised platform that required visitors to look up at her, reinforcing the hierarchical nature of Vorthak society. Guards and courtiers lined the walls, their crystalline features reflecting the chamber's lighting in ways that made them seem almost supernatural. The queen herself was even more impressive in person than she had been in holographic form. Her crystalline skin had the deep blue coloration that marked her as a member of the oldest Vorthak noble lineages, and her amber eyes held an intelligence that seemed to catalog and evaluate everything they saw. When she spoke, her voice carried easily through the chamber despite its vast size, and every word was chosen with the precision of someone accustomed to having their statements analyzed for hidden meanings. She began by formally acknowledging Marcus's service to her daughter and to the Empire, speaking in the ceremonial language that was used for important state occasions. A translator provided running commentary, but Marcus found that he could follow much of what she said through context and the basic Vorthak phrases he had learned during the voyage. The ceremony was clearly important to the queen, representing her public recognition of the debt that his actions had created. However, the formal acknowledgement was only the beginning of what proved to be a much longer and more complex conversation. Queen Vestra dismissed most of the courtiers and guards, leaving only her closest advisors present as she shifted to a more informal discussion of Marcus's future role within the Empire. She made it clear that she had studied detailed reports of his background and capabilities, and she had specific plans for how his skills could be utilized. The queen explained that the royal guard was traditionally composed exclusively of Vorthak warriors who had proven their loyalty through years of service and demonstrated competence in combat. However, the current security threats facing the royal family required new approaches and perspectives. Marcus's human background gave him advantages in thinking patterns and tactical approaches that might be crucial in detecting threats that Vorthak guards would miss. More importantly, his willingness to sacrifice himself for Princess Alera had demonstrated a type of loyalty that the queen considered extremely rare and valuable. Most individuals, regardless of species, acted primarily from self-interest even when they appeared to be serving others. Marcus had shown that he was capable of truly selfless action, and the queen believed that such individuals could serve as examples to inspire similar loyalty in others. The position she was offering him was unprecedented in Vorthak history. He would be given the rank of Honor Guard, a title that placed him directly under the queen's personal command and gave him access to areas of the palace that were normally restricted to family members. His primary responsibility would be protecting the royal family, but he would also serve as an advisor on security matters and as a liaison with human and other alien governments. The benefits of accepting this position were substantial. He would receive compensation that would make him wealthy by human standards, access to Vorthak technology, and medical care that could extend his lifespan considerably, and opportunities for advancement within the imperial hierarchy that were normally unavailable to non-Vorthak individuals. He would also have the queen's personal protection, which meant that few individuals in the galaxy would dare to threaten him. However, Queen Vestra also made it clear that accepting the position would require certain commitments that could not be easily undone. He would be expected to swear a formal oath of loyalty to the royal family and to the Empire, binding him to serve for a minimum period of 10 standard years. During that time, he would be considered a member of the royal household, which meant that leaving without permission would be considered desertion and would carry severe penalties. The queen paused at this point, allowing Marcus time to consider the implications of what she was proposing. She had presented the offer in terms that made it sound like a tremendous opportunity, but the underlying message was clear. She had decided that he belonged to the Vorthak Empire now, and his personal preferences about the matter were not particularly relevant to her decision-making process. Marcus found himself in an impossible position. Accepting the queen's offer would mean abandoning his previous life and committing himself to serving an alien government whose long-term goals he did not fully understand. Refusing it would likely result in consequences that the queen had not explicitly described, but that he suspected would be extremely unpleasant. The debt of honor that his actions had created was being used to justify what amounted to sophisticated kidnapping. Princess Zalera had been present during the formal ceremony, but had remained silent throughout the more detailed discussion of his future role. However, Marcus could see the concern in her amber eyes and the tension in her crystalline features. She clearly felt responsible for his predicament, but she was also bound by the same cultural constraints that prevented her from openly contradicting her mother in front of the royal court. The queen eventually asked for his response to her offer, making it clear that she expected an answer immediately rather than time to consider his options. Marcus realized that this was a test as much as it was a negotiation. How he handled this moment would determine not only his own future, but also how the queen viewed his character and potential value to the empire. Looking around the throne room at the assembled courtiers and guards, Marcus understood that he was witnessing a pivotal moment in his life. Everything that happened from this point forward will be shaped by the decision he made in the next few minutes. The queen was offering him power and privilege beyond anything he had ever imagined, but the price would be his freedom and possibly his identity as a human being. The silence in the throne room stretched on as Marcus weighed his options, knowing that Queen Vestra was evaluating his every expression and gesture for clues about his character and intentions. Whatever he said next would either seal his fate as a permanent member of the Vorthak royal household or set in motion events that could have consequences far beyond his personal situation. The human who had simply wanted to do his job protecting a princess during peace negotiations was about to discover just how far the ripples of a single heroic act could spread. Marcus took a deep breath and looked directly at Queen Vestra, knowing that his next words would determine the course of his entire future. The throne room remained absolutely silent as he considered his response, and he could feel the weight of dozens of alien eyes watching his every movement. Finally, he spoke with the same straightforward honesty that had guided his actions throughout his military and security career. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the crystal chamber, "I am honored by your offer and grateful for the recognition of my actions. However, I must respectfully request time to understand exactly what my service would entail and what it would mean for my connections to my own people. I have family and obligations on Earth that I cannot simply abandon without consideration." The queen's amber eyes narrowed slightly at his response, and Marcus could sense a shift in the atmosphere of the room. Several of the courtiers exchanged glances that suggested his request for time was not what they had expected to hear. Queen Vestra remained silent for several long moments, clearly evaluating both his words and his manner of speaking. "Interesting," she finally said, her voice carrying a tone that Marcus could not quite interpret. "Most individuals would either accept such an offer immediately or refuse it outright. You speak of obligations to your people, yet you have already demonstrated that you are willing to sacrifice yourself for someone from another species entirely. Tell me, Marcus Chun of Earth, what obligations could be more important than the honor I am offering you?" Marcus realized that he was walking a diplomatic tightrope that could snap at any moment. The queen was testing him, trying to understand his motivations and character through his responses to her pressure. He decided that his best strategy would be complete honesty, even if it meant risking her displeasure. "Your Majesty, I have a younger sister who depends on my financial support for her medical treatment. I also have commitments to other members of my security team who trusted me to return from this assignment. Beyond that, accepting your generous offer would mean that I could never again visit my home world or maintain relationships with my own people. These are not decisions that I can make lightly, regardless of the honor being offered." Queen Vestra rose from her throne and descended the steps toward Marcus, her crystalline robes flowing around her in patterns that seemed almost liquid. As she approached, he could see that her expression had changed from one of mild curiosity to something more complex. When she spoke again, her voice was lower but somehow more intense. "You speak of loyalty to your people and family, yet you showed no such hesitation when you chose to protect my daughter. In that moment, you acted without thought for your own obligations or commitments. Why should this decision be different?" Marcus met her gaze steadily, understanding that this was the crucial moment in their confrontation. "Your Majesty, when I protected Princess Zalera, I was acting on instinct to prevent immediate harm to an innocent person. That required no calculation or consideration of consequences. However, the decision you are asking me to make now would affect not only my entire future, but also the lives of people who depend on me. I believe that making such a decision hastily would actually dishonor the very qualities that led me to protect your daughter in the first place." The queen stopped directly in front of him, close enough that he could see the intricate patterns in her crystalline skin and smell the faint ozone scent that seemed to surround all Vorthak individuals. For a moment, Marcus thought she might be angry at his continued resistance to her offer. Instead, she began to smile, an expression that transformed her imperious features into something almost approachable. "Fascinating," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else in the room. "You continue to demonstrate exactly the qualities that make you valuable to me, even while attempting to resist my will. Very well, Marcus Chen. I will grant you time to consider my offer and to make arrangements regarding your earthly obligations. However, this time will not be unlimited, and it will not be unsupervised." The queen turned and walked back toward her throne, but she continued speaking as she moved. "You will remain here on Zentera as my guest while you consider your decision. Princess Zalera will serve as your guide and advisor, helping you to understand what life in the royal household would entail. You will have access to communication systems that will allow you to speak with your family and associates on Earth, and you may make whatever arrangements you feel are necessary for their welfare." Marcus felt a mixture of relief and apprehension at this unexpected compromise. The queen was giving him the time he had requested, but she was also ensuring that he remained within her sphere of influence while he made his decision. He suspected that she was confident that extended exposure to Vorthak culture and technology would eventually convince him to accept her offer voluntarily. However, Queen Vestra continued, settling back on her throne with fluid grace. "You should understand that my patience, while considerable, is not infinite. You will have 30 standard days to reach a decision. At the end of that time, I will expect a final answer, and I will not be inclined to grant further extensions or compromises." The formal audience concluded with ceremonial phrases and gestures that Marcus was still learning to interpret, but he understood that he had been dismissed for the present. As he was escorted from the throne room by Princess Zalera and a small honor guard, he realized that he had gained a temporary reprieve, but had not actually escaped from his dilemma. Queen Vestra had simply transformed his imprisonment from an immediate reality into a delayed inevitability. Princess Zalera remained quiet until they had left the formal areas of the palace and entered what appeared to be a more residential section. The corridors here were still magnificent by human standards, but they had a more personal and comfortable atmosphere than the ceremonial spaces. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a mixture of admiration and concern. "That was either very brave or very foolish," she said, glancing at Marcus as they walked. "My mother is not accustomed to having her offers questioned, especially by individuals who are in no position to negotiate with her. The fact that she granted your request suggests that she finds you even more intriguing than I had realized." Marcus was beginning to understand that Princess Zalera was far more perceptive than her formal diplomatic demeanor had initially suggested. She had observed the entire exchange between him and the queen with obvious interest, and she seemed to understand the implications of what had transpired better than he did himself. "Can you tell me honestly," he asked as they continued walking, "what you think will happen if I ultimately refuse her offer? Your mother presented it as a tremendous honor, but she also made it clear that refusing would have consequences that she chose not to specify." Princess Zalera stopped walking and turned to face him directly, her amber eyes reflecting the soft crystal lighting of the corridor. "Marcus, you need to understand that my mother does not make idle threats, but she also does not typically resort to crude coercion when dealing with individuals she respects. The fact that she offered you time to consider her proposal suggests that she believes you will eventually choose to serve the Empire voluntarily." She resumed walking, but her pace was slower now, as if she were choosing her words carefully. However, You should also understand that refusing a direct offer from the Queen of the Vorthak Empire would create diplomatic complications that could affect relationships between our species for generations. She has publicly acknowledged her debt to you and has offered you a position of unprecedented honor for a non-Vorthak individual. Rejecting that offer could be interpreted as rejecting the Empire itself. Marcus was beginning to appreciate the sophistication of the trap that Queen Vestra had constructed around him. By framing her demand for his service as a generous offer and by making it public knowledge, she had created a situation where refusing would carry implications far beyond his personal preferences. His decision would be seen as a statement about human attitudes toward the Vorthak Empire and could potentially affect future relationships between their species. The quarters assigned to Marcus were more luxurious than any accommodations he had ever experienced, occupying an entire suite of rooms that overlooked the palace's central courtyard. The technology integrated into the living spaces was seamlessly elegant, responding to his needs almost before he was aware of them himself. However, he noticed that while the quarters were magnificent, they were also clearly designed to keep their occupant comfortable while preventing unauthorized departure. Over the following days, Princess Zalera proved to be a knowledgeable guide to Vorthak culture and an unexpectedly engaging companion. She showed him through various sections of the palace, introduced him to other members of the royal household, and patiently explained the complex social dynamics that govern life in the imperial court. Marcus began to understand that her earlier formal demeanor had been a diplomatic facade, and that her actual personality was both more complex and more appealing than he had initially realized. The princess seemed genuinely interested in human culture and perspectives, asking detailed questions about Earth society and Marcus's own background. She was particularly curious about human concepts of individual freedom and personal choice, which she explained were less prominent in Vorthak culture, where social obligations and family honor typically took precedence over individual desires. Through their conversations, Marcus learned that Princess Zalera's position within the royal family was more complicated than he had initially understood. As the youngest of Queen Vestra's children, she had traditionally been seen as less important in terms of succession planning. However, her success in the recent diplomatic negotiations had elevated her status considerably, creating both opportunities and dangers for her future. The assassination attempt that Marcus had thwarted was apparently part of a larger campaign against the royal family that had been orchestrated by a coalition of noble houses who opposed Queen Vestra's policies. These houses believed that the empire had become too focused on external expansion and not sufficiently attentive to the traditional values that had made the Vorthak great. They saw the younger generation of royals, particularly Princess Zalera, as being too willing to accommodate alien influences and perspectives. Marcus began to understand that his presence in the royal household was significant beyond the personal debt that Queen Vestra felt she owed him. By bringing a human into the royal guard, she was making a statement about the empire's future direction and its willingness to incorporate the best qualities from other species. However, this same decision was also providing ammunition to her political opponents, who could point to his presence as evidence of the royal family's abandonment of Vorthak traditions. The communication system in his quarters allowed Marcus to speak regularly with his sister and other family members on Earth, though he was careful not to reveal too much about his actual circumstances. His sister Sarah was undergoing treatment for a rare neurological condition that required expensive, ongoing care, and Marcus had been her primary source of financial support for several years. The security company he worked for had agreed to continue her medical coverage for a limited time, but they could not maintain that support indefinitely if he did not return to active duty. These conversations with his family reinforced the impossible nature of his situation. Accepting Queen Vestra's offer would provide him with resources that could ensure his sister's care for the rest of her life, but it would also mean that he might never be able to see her again. The Vorthak Empire's relationship with Earth was currently limited to formal diplomatic contacts, and private travel between the species was extremely rare and difficult to arrange. As the days passed, Marcus found himself genuinely impressed by many aspects of Vorthak society and culture. Their technology was remarkable, their art was beautiful, and their social systems, while rigid by human standards, provided stability and purpose for billions of individuals. The royal household operated with efficiency and elegance that made human government institutions look crude by comparison, and the people he met treated him with respect and curiosity rather than the hostility he had expected. However, he also became increasingly aware of the fundamental differences between human and Vorthack values. The concept of individual choice that was central to human culture was much less important in Vorthack society, where social harmony and collective purpose took precedence over personal preferences. This difference was not necessarily negative, but it meant that his reluctance to accept Queen Vestra's offer was genuinely difficult for most Vorthack individuals to understand. Princess Zalera seemed to be the exception to this general pattern, showing an unusual appreciation for human perspectives on individual freedom and personal choice. During one of their conversations, she confided that her exposure to other species during diplomatic missions had led her to question some of the assumptions that underpinned traditional Vorthack society. This admission created a bond of understanding between them that went beyond their initial relationship as protector and protected. As the end of his 30-day consideration period approached, Marcus realized that his decision would affect far more than just his own life. Queen Vestra's interest in him was clearly part of a larger political strategy that involved the future direction of the Vorthack Empire and its relationships with other species. Princess Zalera's safety and political position might also be affected by his choice, since her association with him had already made her a target for those who opposed the royal family's policies. The weight of these responsibilities was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced in his previous career. When he had signed up to protect Princess Zalera during the peace negotiations, he had thought he understood what he was committing himself to do. Now he was facing a decision that could affect the lives of millions of individuals across multiple star systems, and he was running out of time to find a solution that would honor all of his competing obligations. With only 3 days remaining before his deadline, Marcus found himself in the palace gardens during the early hours of the morning when most of the royal household was still sleeping. The gardens were a marvel of biotechnology and artistic design, featuring plants from dozens of different worlds that had been adapted to thrive in Zentara's unique environment. The crystalline trees seemed to hum with internal energy, their translucent leaves creating patterns of colored light that shifted with the planet's rotation. He had spent most of the night reviewing the various communications he had received from Earth over the past weeks. His sister Sarah's medical condition was stabilizing under the current treatment regimen, but her doctors had made it clear that the expensive therapies would need to continue for years to maintain her improvement. His security company had offered him extended leave to resolve his situation with the Vorthack Empire, but they could not hold his position indefinitely. More troubling were the reports he had received about the political fallout from his prolonged absence. News of his situation had somehow reached human media outlets, where it was being portrayed as everything from a diplomatic triumph to an example of alien manipulation of human personnel. The Terran government was under pressure from some factions to demand his immediate release, while others argued that his service to the Vorthack Empire could provide valuable intelligence and diplomatic opportunities. Princess Zalera found him there as the first light of dawn began to filter through the crystal canopy above the gardens. She had clearly been looking for him, and her expression suggested that she had something important to discuss. Over the past weeks, their daily conversations had become the highlight of his time on Zentara, providing both intellectual stimulation and emotional connection that helped him cope with his isolation from human contact. "You seem troubled," she observed, settling gracefully onto a nearby bench carved for what appeared to be a single piece of jade crystal. "I assume you have been contemplating your decision about my mother's offer." Marcus nodded, but he remained standing as he tried to organize his thoughts. "I've been thinking about all the people whose lives will be affected by whatever choice I make. My family on Earth, the diplomatic relationships between our species, your own position within the royal court, and countless other consequences that I probably don't even understand yet." Princess Zalera was quiet for several moments, her amber eyes reflecting the growing light from the crystalline trees around them. When she spoke, her voice carried a thoughtfulness that had become familiar to Marcus over their weeks of conversations. "You know," she said slowly, "I've been wondering whether my mother truly expects you to accept her offer willingly, or whether she has been testing your character through this entire process. She has had ample opportunity to simply compel your compliance through various means, but Instead, she has chosen to allow you time to consider your options and to observe how you handle the pressure of your situation. This perspective had not occurred to Marcus, but it made sense given what he had learned about Queen Vestra's strategic thinking over the past weeks. The Queen was known throughout the galaxy for her ability to identify and cultivate talent, often through methods that tested individuals under stress to reveal their true capabilities and character traits. What do you think she's actually testing? Marcus asked, sitting down on the bench beside the princess. My loyalty? My intelligence? My willingness to sacrifice my personal interests for larger purposes? Perhaps all of those things, Princess Zalera replied, but I suspect she is most interested in understanding how you balance competing loyalties and obligations. The quality that made you valuable to her in the first place was your willingness to act selflessly to protect someone who meant nothing to you personally. But that same quality becomes much more complex when you are forced to choose between different groups of people who all have legitimate claims on your loyalty. Marcus realized that Princess Zalera had accurately identified the core of his dilemma. His decision was not simply about accepting or rejecting Queen Vestra's offer, but about determining which of his various obligations and loyalties should take precedence when they came into conflict with each other. The human who had instinctively protected an alien princess was now being forced to choose between protecting his own family and serving the interests of an alien empire. There's something else I need to tell you, Princess Zalera continued, her voice taking on a more serious tone. The intelligence reports we have been receiving suggest that the threats against the royal family are escalating. The coalition of noble houses that opposes my mother's policies has been growing bolder in their actions, and there have been several incidents in the past week that suggest they may be planning something more dramatic than individual assassination attempts. This information added another layer of complexity to Marcus's situation. If the threats against the royal family were indeed escalating, then his decision about whether to accept Queen Vestra's offer could have immediate implication for the safety of people he had come to care about. Princess Zalera, in particular, had shown him kindness and understanding that went far beyond what he had any right to expect from someone of her status. What kind of incidents? Marcus asked, his security training automatically focusing on the tactical implications of the information she was sharing. Surveillance of royal family members during their public appearances, attempts to infiltrate the palace guard with individuals whose loyalty is questionable, and intelligence suggesting that weapons and equipment have been moved to strategic positions around the capital city. My mother's security advisors believe that a coordinated attack on the palace itself may be imminent. Marcus felt a familiar tension building in his chest as his mind shifted into the analytical mode that had served him well throughout his military and security career. If the palace was indeed facing a coordinated attack, then the royal family's safety would depend on having security personnel who could think beyond conventional Vorhack tactical approaches. His human perspective and experience with asymmetric threats could be crucial in detecting and countering attack methods that the regular palace guard might not anticipate. Has anyone considered the possibility that this entire situation might be connected to my presence here? Marcus asked. The coalition opposing your mother could be using my case as a symbol of what they see as inappropriate alien influence on the royal family. My continued presence in the palace could be escalating the very threats that Queen Vestra wants me to help counter. Princess Zalera turned to look at him directly, her expression showing surprise at his suggestion. You think that our enemies are using you as a justification for their actions? It's possible, Marcus replied, his mind working through the implications. Think about it from their perspective. Here's a human who saved the life of a royal family member and is now being offered an unprecedented position within the royal guard. If you're trying to convince other noble houses that the queen has lost sight of traditional Vorhack values, my case would be perfect propaganda material. The princess was quiet for several minutes, clearly considering this possibility. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of concern that Marcus had not heard before. If you're correct about this, then your decision about my mother's offer becomes even more complicated. Accepting it could provide our enemies with additional ammunition for their cause, but refusing it could be seen as validation of their arguments about alien influences being temporary and unreliable. Marcus realized that he had stumbled upon what might be the true purpose behind Queen Vestra's offer and her insistence on giving him time to consider it. The Queen was not simply testing his character or trying to recruit his services. She was creating a public demonstration of human loyalty and capability that would either strengthen or weaken her political position, depending on how it was resolved. "Your mother is more clever than I gave her credit for," Marcus said with grudging admiration. "She's created a situation where my decision will send a clear message about human-Vorthack relations regardless of what I choose. If I accept her offer, it demonstrates that humans can be trusted with important responsibilities within the Empire. If I refuse, it suggests that humans are too unreliable or too focused on their own interests to be valuable long-term allies." Princess Zalera smiled at this analysis, but her expression remained troubled. "My mother rarely does anything for only one reason. She undoubtedly sees value in having your specific skills and perspectives available to the Royal Guard, but you are correct that the symbolic importance of your decision may be equally important to her strategic calculations." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Commander HFY Legends, whose expression immediately told Marcus that something significant had happened. The Vorthack officer approached them with a rapid, purposeful stride that Marcus had learned to associate with urgent security situations. "Your Highness," Commander HFY Legends said, addressing Princess Zalera with formal courtesy before turning to Marcus. "Honor Guard Shun, Queen Vestra requests your immediate presence in the security center. We have received intelligence indicating that the threats against the royal family may be more imminent than we previously believed." The title Honor Guard Shun caught Marcus by surprise, since he had not yet formally accepted the Queen's offer. However, he realized that in a crisis situation, Queen Vestra was apparently willing to treat him as if he had already committed to serving the Empire. This could be a test of his willingness to act in defense of the royal family, even while his official status remained uncertain. The security center was located in the heavily fortified lower levels of the palace, its walls lined with displays showing surveillance data from throughout the capital city and the surrounding region. Queen Vestra was present along with her senior military advisors, all of whom were focused intently on a large tactical display that showed the positions of various military units and suspected hostile forces. "Marcus," the Queen said without preamble as he entered the room, "we have confirmed that a coordinated attack on the palace is planned for tonight. The enemy forces include not only Vorthack dissidents, but also mercenaries from several other species who have been hired to provide capabilities that our own security systems are not designed to counter. Your experience with multi-species tactical situations could be crucial in developing our defensive strategy." Marcus found himself thrust into the role he had been avoiding for weeks, but the immediate nature of the crisis overrode his concerns about the long-term implications of his involvement. People he cared about were in danger, and his skills and experience could make the difference between their safety and their deaths. The political complications of his situation suddenly seemed less important than the immediate need to protect innocent lives. "What do we know about their planned approach and timeline?" Marcus asked, automatically shifting into the professional mindset that had served him throughout his career. "And what resources do we have available for the defense?" The next several hours were spent in intensive planning sessions as the royal security forces prepared for the expected attack. Marcus found himself working closely with Vorthack military professionals whose tactical thinking was sophisticated but followed patterns that could be predicted and countered by enemies who understood their cultural approach to warfare. His suggestions for alternative defensive strategies and unconventional countermeasures were initially met with skepticism, but gradually gained acceptance as their potential effectiveness became apparent. As night fell over the capital city, Marcus realized that he had effectively made his decision about Queen Vestra's offer through his actions rather than through any formal declaration. He was now fully committed to defending the royal family against their enemies, and the symbolic implications of that commitment would ripple through both human and Vorthack society regardless of how the immediate crisis was resolved. The attack began precisely at midnight, with coordinated strikes against multiple targets throughout the palace complex. Marcus found himself in the center of a battle that would test everything he had learned about courage, loyalty, and the true meaning of honor in a universe where individual choices could have consequences that spanned entire civilizations. The first explosions shattered the crystalline windows of the security center as enemy forces launched their coordinated assault on the palace complex. Marcus had positioned himself near the tactical display where he could monitor the developing situation and provide real-time analysis of the attacker's strategies. The defensive preparations they had made throughout the day were now being put to the test as hostile forces struck from multiple directions simultaneously. They're using a classic pincer movement. Marcus called out over the sound of alarms and weapons fire, but they've modified it to account for Vorthack defensive doctrines. See how they're concentrating their initial strikes on the ceremonial entrances while sending smaller teams toward the service areas? They know your guards will expect the main assault to come through the formal approaches. Queen Vestra stood at the center of the security center like the eye of a storm, her crystalline features reflecting the flashing lights from dozens of tactical displays. She was coordinating the defense with the calm efficiency of someone who had commanded military operations for decades. But Marcus could see the tension in her posture as reports continued to arrive from various sections of the palace. Commander Tichwisis, the Queen ordered, redeploy the secondary guard units to protect the service entrances as Honor Guardian suggested. The ceremonial entrances are heavily fortified enough to withstand the initial assault, but if the enemy gains access through the maintenance areas, they could strike at the residential sections before we can respond. Marcus noticed that she continued to use his honorary title even though he had never formally accepted her offer. In the midst of the battle, such distinctions seemed less important than ensuring that everyone understood their roles and responsibilities. He was functioning as an integral part of the royal security apparatus, and the symbolic implications of that participation would have to be dealt with after the immediate crisis was resolved. Princess Zalera appeared at his side, wearing combat armor that had been adapted for her crystalline physiology, but which still allowed her natural grace of movement. The intelligence reports were accurate, she said, her voice tense with concentration. Our surveillance systems have identified at least 40 attackers, including mercenaries from the Krellian military and what appear to be human infiltrators using advanced stealth technology. The presence of human mercenaries among the attacking forces added another layer of complexity to the situation. Marcus realized that his own involvement in the palace defense could be seen as humans fighting on both sides of a Vorthack political conflict, which might have significant diplomatic implications for Earth's relationship with the Empire. However, the immediate threat to people he cared about took precedence over such considerations. The human infiltrators will be using tactics that your regular security forces haven't encountered before, Marcus told Commander THYSS. They'll try to disable your sensor networks and create confusion about the location and size of the main assault. I recommend activating backup surveillance systems and establishing manual communication protocols that don't rely on the primary networks. The battle raged throughout the palace complex for the next several hours, with attack and counterattack flowing through corridors and chambers that had not seen military action in centuries. Marcus found himself moving between different defensive positions, providing tactical advice and occasionally engaging in direct combat when hostile forces broke through the primary defensive lines. His human training and experience proved valuable in ways he had not anticipated. The attackers had planned their assault based on extensive knowledge of Vorthack military doctrines and defensive strategies, but they had not accounted for the presence of someone who thought about tactical problems from an entirely different cultural perspective. Marcus was able to identify several attack patterns that the regular palace guards had missed, allowing them to counter threats before they could develop into serious breaches of the defensive perimeter. The most dangerous moment came when a team of Krellian infiltrators managed to reach the residential section of the palace, where the younger members of the royal family were sheltering. The attackers had bypassed the main defensive lines by using maintenance tunnels that were not covered by the standard security protocols, and they were moving toward the royal quarters with equipment designed to neutralize the personal protection systems that guarded individual family members. Marcus reached the residential section just as the infiltrators were beginning their assault on the protective barriers around Princess Zalera's quarters. The Krellian warriors were using biotechnology weapons similar to the one that had nearly killed him during the original assassination attempt, but their tactics were more sophisticated and coordinated than the single attacker he had faced before. The fighting in the narrow corridors of the residential section was intense and personal, with no room for elaborate tactical maneuvers or long-range weapons. Marcus found himself engaged in close combat with alien warriors whose physical capabilities exceeded his own, but whose tactical thinking followed predictable patterns that he could exploit through superior positioning and unconventional approaches. He managed to eliminate 3 of the infiltrators before backup arrived in the form of Commander THYSS and a squad of Royal Guards. The remaining attackers were quickly overwhelmed, but not before they had managed to damage several critical systems and create enough chaos to mask the movements of other hostile forces elsewhere in the palace. As the immediate threat to the residential section was neutralized, Marcus received an urgent communication from Queen Vestra, summoning him back to the security center. When he arrived, he found the situation had evolved in ways that would require difficult decisions about the defense strategy and the deployment of the remaining security forces. The main assault was a diversion, the Queen explained as he studied the tactical displays. While we were focused on protecting the palace complex itself, enemy forces have seized control of several key installations in the capital city, including the primary power generation facility and the communications center. They are now in a position to cut off our external support and isolate us completely. Marcus realized that the attackers had executed a much more sophisticated plan than anyone had anticipated. Rather than simply attempting to overwhelm the palace defenses through direct assault, they had created a complex multi-phase operation designed to achieve strategic control over the entire capital region. The assault on the palace had been intended to draw security forces into defensive positions while the real objectives were achieved elsewhere. How long before they can complete their control of the city infrastructure? Marcus asked, studying the intelligence reports flowing across the displays. Perhaps 6 hours, Commander THYSS replied grimly. Once they have consolidated their positions, they will be able to demand the surrender of the royal family under threat of cutting off all power and communications to the palace. Even our defensive systems cannot operate indefinitely without external power sources. Queen Vestra turned to Marcus with an expression that combined respect with desperate calculation. Honor guard, Shun. Your analysis of their tactical approach has been more accurate than our own intelligence assessments. What do you recommend as our response to this development? Marcus found himself in the position he had been trying to avoid for weeks, formally advising the Queen of the Vorthak Empire on matters that could determine the fate of her reign and the future direction of galactic politics. However, the lives of people he cared about depended on his ability to think clearly and provide sound tactical guidance. We need to shift from defensive to offensive operations, he said after studying the available information. The enemy has achieved surprise and tactical advantage by seizing the initiative, but their positions in the city are probably not as secure as they appear. If we can mount coordinated counterstrikes against their key installations before they have time to consolidate, we might be able to regain control of the situation. The plan that emerged from the subsequent discussions was ambitious and risky, requiring the Royal Guard to abandon their defensive positions and launch simultaneous attacks on multiple targets throughout the capital city. Marcus found himself designated as one of the strike team leaders, responsible for coordinating the assault on the communications center, while other teams moved against the power facility and the command posts that were directing the enemy operations. The counterattack began before dawn, with Royal Guard units moving through the city using routes and tactics that Marcus had suggested based on his analysis of the enemy's deployment patterns. The fighting was fierce as both sides committed their remaining reserves to what everyone understood would be the decisive phase of the battle. Marcus led his team through the industrial section of the capital city, using his knowledge of urban warfare techniques to approach the communications center from directions that the defenders had not adequately prepared for. The facility was heavily guarded, but the enemy forces were positioned to repel conventional attacks rather than the unconventional approach that Marcus had planned. The assault on the communications center succeeded after several hours of intense fighting, but the cost was significant. Marcus had been wounded during the final assault, and several members of his team had been killed or seriously injured. However, their success in regaining control of the communications network allowed Queen Vestra to coordinate the other phases of the counterattack and to call for reinforcements from loyal military units stationed outside the capital region. By midday, the rebellion had been effectively crushed, with most of the enemy leaders either captured or killed. The noble houses that had supported the coup attempt were facing the prospect of severe punishment, while those who had remained loyal to the queen were being rewarded with increased status and privileges within the imperial hierarchy. Marcus found himself back in the medical facility where his adventure had begun weeks earlier, receiving treatment for injuries sustained during the communications center assault. However, this time Princess Zalera was not the only royal family member present at his bedside. Queen Vestra herself had come to personally thank him for his role in defending the empire and to formally resolve the question of his future status. "Honor guard, Shun," the queen said, her voice carrying a warmth that he had never heard before. "You have proven beyond any doubt that your loyalty to the royal family and to the empire is genuine and absolute. Your actions during the crisis have saved not only individual lives, but the stability of our government itself. I am prepared to offer you any reward within my power to grant." Marcus looked at both the queen and Princess Zalera, understanding that this was the moment when all of the complications and conflicts of the past weeks would finally be resolved. His decision about whether to accept formal service with the Vorthak Empire could no longer be postponed or negotiated. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "I have come to understand that my situation was never really about a simple choice between accepting or rejecting your offer. The events of the past weeks have shown me that the relationships between different species and governments are far more complex than I initially realized, and that individual actions can have consequences that extend far beyond personal preferences." Queen Vestra smiled at this response, recognizing that Marcus had learned to think in the strategic terms that govern her own approach to leadership and decision-making. "I would like to propose a different arrangement," Marcus continued. "Rather than accepting permanent service within the Royal Guard, I would like to serve as a liaison between the Vorthak Empire and Earth, helping to build stronger relationships between our peoples while maintaining my connections to both cultures. This would allow me to honor my obligations to your family, while also fulfilling my responsibilities to my own people." The Queen considered this proposal for several long moments, clearly evaluating its implications for her own political strategies and the Empire's long-term interests. Finally, she nodded with apparent satisfaction. "Honor guard, Shun," she said formally. "I accept your proposal and hereby appoint you as Special Ambassador for Human Vorthak Relations, with all the privileges and responsibilities that such a position entails. You will divide your time between Zentera and Earth, serving both our peoples in the cause of mutual understanding and cooperation." As Marcus accepted this new role, he realized that his journey from security contractor to galactic diplomat had taught him important lessons about honor, loyalty, and the true meaning of heroism. Sometimes the greatest service an individual could provide was not the dramatic gesture of self-sacrifice, but the patient work of building bridges between different worlds and different ways of thinking. Princess Zalera squeezed his hand gently, her amber eyes reflecting satisfaction at the resolution they had achieved. "You know," she said quietly, "I think my mother planned this outcome from the very beginning. She never really wanted to keep you as a prisoner. She wanted to transform you into something much more valuable, a permanent link between our peoples that would benefit both of our civilizations for generations to come." Marcus smiled as he contemplated his new future, one that would allow him to honor all of his competing loyalties while serving a purpose larger than any he had previously imagined. The human who had simply wanted to do his job protecting a princess during peace negotiations had become something unprecedented in galactic history. A bridge between worlds, built from courage, understanding, and the refusal to let fear determine the boundaries of what was possible. In the end, Queen Vestra's refusal to release him had become the foundation for a new kind of freedom, one that would allow him to serve both humanity and the wider galactic community in ways that no human had ever been permitted to do before. The Prison of Honor had become a platform for unprecedented opportunity, and Marcus Chun was ready to embrace whatever challenges and adventures lay ahead in his role as humanity's first interstellar diplomat.